Welcome to Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.
Hello, welcome to Governance Minutes. My name is Ken Bertsch. With me today is Scott McClesky, Global Head of Regulatory Intelligence at Thomson Reuters. So there are questions on best approaches to board oversight of risk, and that's what we're really going to focus on today. There's renewed attention on these issues right now, in part because there's a New York Bar Association petition to the New York Stock Exchange questioning a little bit an NYSC rule on audit committee responsibility for risk. There's also a different but related pending proposal at NASDAQ. So this issue, again, is how exactly and where on the board should risk be dealt with. Scott, could you explain a little bit of what you understand of the issue right now?
Sure. I think the starting place needs to be understanding what the NYSC rule actually says. And it's worth noting that this is a fairly old rule as things go. It goes back several years. And post-Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley, there was an emphasis on giving more responsibility to the audit committee of boards to make sure that there was some specific responsibility for a lot of the problems that corporations had been having. And remember that this is a point in history before we had the growth of a lot of risk committees as we have now. So it was the logical place. I think it's also worth remembering that the rule does not specifically say the audit committee has to be responsible for risk. What it says is that among the other things that it does, the audit committee should discuss and review in general terms the policies and procedures over risk. And the written discussion from the NYSC on this rule acknowledges that risk may be dealt with in other parts of the board. So I do think, though, that the Bar Association has a point that this requires some modernization to reflect, first of all, the increasing breadth of risks that companies face. I think that there are a lot of risks out there right now that aren't really related to the core business of an audit committee, which is to look after the financials. There are operational risks, for instance. And so I think that there needs to be the flexibility for a board to determine exactly where risk should be handled. Now, what does that mean with respect to the rule? The rule says, well, the audit committee just has to discuss these things and have a general look at the policies and procedures. I think there is a danger there, though, that giving the audit committee purview over the policies and procedures could effectively give them an administrative veto over decisions that are made elsewhere in the board. So on balance, I think that it's not a bad rule, it's just a little bit of a dated rule, and it could stand some tweaking. Okay.
You mentioned a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about different kinds of risks?
Sure.
Some of it has to do with really financial reporting, which is different from financial risk, which is different from all sorts of operational risks that may be specific.
Right. And I think that there's a tendency, depending on the industry, to think about risk in terms of the financial risk, currencies or commodities in your supply chain. But think about some of the things that have really hit some corporations in the teeth over the past few years. Think of Toyota and the problems that they had with their brakes. Think about Massey Mining and the explosion. Think about British Petroleum. Ask them about what their risks are. And these are all what would generally be termed operational risks, which are failures, losses due to failures in people, processes, and systems. A person on an audit committee is not necessarily going to have the tools to deal with those kinds of risks and the risk management process in general. So you have a lot of different risks, and although it will vary from industry to industry, there are some that nobody is immune to.
Okay. And there are the rules, but then what are companies actually doing? How do you see boards actually managing and distributing the consideration of risk?
It's hard to say that there's an identifiable trend. I think if you look back over the last 5 or 10 years, there have been different approaches that have been tried. If you go back about 5 years, a lot of it was being handled by the full board. Then you started to see some of it migrating over to the audit committee. Now I think that there's no real best practice. I think that in the financial services industry, due to regulatory requirements, there will be a risk committee in many of these financial institutions. I will say that one approach that I'm not a big fan of is to spread it out across all of the committees, because I think that there's a real danger there of creating gaps. You're increasing the level of communication that's expected among board members, and that's frankly just not the way that boards work these days.
Okay, so the New York Bar had a suggestion that a lot of it should really roll up to the full board. Is that?
Yeah, I think what they're suggesting is that ultimate responsibility lies with the board, and then the board can decide either to retain it at that level or to farm it out to the audit committee, to a risk committee, or wherever else. And I think that that kind of flexibility is necessary because of the range of risks that are involved.
Okay. Now, there are a lot of industry-specific risks, but there are also sort of high-profile risks that cut across many. And what do you see as the big concerns right now?
Well, I think one that's gotten a lot of press recently is cybersecurity, and I think it deserves that level of attention because, let me be blunt, there is no company out there that is not exposed to an IT threat. And I'm talking about denial of service, I'm talking about theft of confidential customer information, but even just plain old systems going down. And the reason why I say that nobody is immune to this is because your problem isn't just within your own organization, but within your key vendors as well. So I think that firms, boards in particular, need to ask a lot of questions about, do we have a contingency plan for this? Have we identified where our exposures are outside of the firm? And I think that that's something that really does require focus across all industries. Another thing that I would mention is reputational risk, which in the past has been one of those kind of warm and fuzzy things, we don't want to look bad. But the rise of social media, I think, puts this at a different level. For two reasons. First is that bad news travels fast, whether it is correct or not. And in fact, it could spread before you've had a chance to point out that this is actually not true. And at the same time, it makes it a lot easier to organize boycotts. And so I think firms with retail customers in particular are vulnerable to this kind of thing. There's real reputational damage, real economic damage that arises from this. And also, look, the regulators read the papers and look at the websites as well. If they see that there's a lot of discussion about a particular issue, it's almost impossible for them not to get involved. So I think that reputational risk now is a very concrete problem for corporations in all industries.
Okay. I wanted to ask you a little bit, just to bring it back to our members, what the folks preparing materials for the board can do or help organize the board meetings, the corporate secretary and other governance officers. Particularly, it seems to me some discussions of risk that I've heard have a lot of jargon, can be difficult to understand. And also, sometimes risk can be like everything. It can be the whole world and hard to bring back in. So I can imagine it's tough for directors.
It is. You're right that there's a lot of jargon, and there's also related to that jargon, there are specific models and methodologies that are used within a firm and best practice across industries. And so I think that it's necessary that the corporate secretaries really need to hold the feet to the fire of the people that are providing this and make it concise. I think it's good to use a lot of dashboards and visuals. And remember that the purpose of this board pack is to tee up discussion. There's a tendency to try to get all the information out, in 6 or 7 pages, which frankly is not going to be read. And that actually raises another thing, which is a pet peeve of mine, and I think everybody, which is the timing of the board packs. If you're getting a board pack the size of a small book one day before the board meeting, as a board member, that places you in a very awkward position because the assumption will be that you've read that you asked whatever questions you needed to ask during the board meeting. So I think that, again, something that the people that prepare the packs should do is make sure that they are complete, intelligible, and on time.
Okay, that's good. We've got a little bit of more time, but maybe I can ask one more question about with an increased focus on risk. Do boards have the right skill sets now? Do you see a need for evolution of skill sets of the member? Speaking generically.
Yeah, I think that there is room, and we've actually seen a lot of demand for board training. Now, let's be clear: it is not the job of the board to check the math of the risk managers, but they need to know what kind of questions they should ask. And this is where I get back to those methodologies I talked about. I think it's important the board members understand and ask questions about what assumptions are in those models? You know, what are the vulnerabilities? You know, have you stress tested this model? And so that's the kind of skill set that I think that board directors need to have. It doesn't require necessarily 30 years in the industry as a risk manager, but I think that it's important to think about what kind of questions you're going to ask to make sure that your risk reports aren't relying on invalid assumptions, because after all, that's the story of the financial crisis.
Right. Okay. Well, this is very good. Thanks very much, Scott.
My pleasure.
We'll be back next month. Thank you.
Join us again next time for Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member, along with contributor Thomson Reuters.